A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Well, let's turn our attention to food and an intentional way of thinking about eating. Our next guest has been reflecting on the fact that Jesus himself was very strategic about meals. He used meals and food to great effect. And there may be some special secrets to discover about being effective as a Christian believer and influencing others to follow Christ and in disciple making. Now, if you don't have the gift of evangelism, and, oftentimes we talk about this, lots of us say we don't have any gifts in that area, you might be able to maximize your strength in eating together with others. Alister is serving with Power to Change, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ, and wonderful to have him back with us. Hey, Alister, welcome back to 2020.
Oh, morning, Neil. Great to be back with you again.
Alister, we often talk about the message more than the method. Let's touch on this method today. You like to talk about what sometimes is like a forgotten key to effectively being a Christian believer and evangelizing, reaching out to others, all about food and hospitality.
That's right. Yeah, and look, I somewhat stumbled upon it, if I can confess that to you, Neil, and all the listeners around Australia. But I've spent the last, I don't know how many months it is now, but quite a number of months with my wife joining Power to Change. And as missionaries, there's a process there of sitting down with people and telling them all about what you're doing. So we've had occasion to have many more meals, people coming over to our place than we've had in a very long time. And so it just dawned on me at some point in that process just what rich and wonderful conversations we were having with people, the preciousness of opening one's home, sitting people down at the dinner table and talking. And in our case, 2 and 3 hour conversations, sometimes even longer, where you really have a chance to eyeball people in a very calm and a relaxed and unpresumptuous kind of atmosphere. And we just had such a wonderful time. And then, by chance, I started looking at the life of Jesus, and I began to put some dots together. And I just wanted to share that with us today, because for those of us who don't have a real sense of evangelistic, fervor, some of us are, dare we say, introverts, and we'd rather just the rest of the world leave us alone. But, there is that commandment in Scripture to go out and make disciples. And here is a key, I believe, that really brings it down to something that is so accessible and approachable for all of us.
And you're calling it Eat Like Jesus, and in some sense it sounds a little too simple.
Yeah, it almost does. It almost does. But here's the thing about Jesus. We have to confront the question, what does it mean that Jesus was fully human? Because if we answer that wrongly, he disappears into the distance, or he becomes divine, but he's not an example that we can follow. But if we think about Jesus' humanity in the right way, then he becomes very approachable. And as we're reading how Jesus lived his life, indeed, how he so focused on meals and used them strategically, it's not just some interesting fact from 2,000 years ago, but it actually becomes something that we can grab a hold of as an example, as something to really consider, that Jesus isn't just divine, but he is fully human. And in his full humanity, he represents for us an example to follow. And the resources that he was able to draw upon are the same resources that are available to us. The power of the Holy Spirit, convictions, opportunities that God lays out, all that sort of thing. What we see Jesus doing and how he engages God and how he uses, in this case, in this conversation, meal times so strategically, that's available to us as well.
Okay, you've been scouring the Gospels. What have you discovered? Is there something special about, does any one of the Gospels stand out above others that has a focus on food and hospitality? Where do you like to look?
I particularly like to look at the Gospel of Luke. Thanks for that question, because Luke he's the physician. He's quite technical in his description. So when Luke points things out, there's always a reason, and he's quite strategic. One phrase that Luke repeats twice, with slight variation, but it's really worth considering, is this phrase, the Son of Man came. The first time, it's actually chronologically wrong, but the second time he uses it is the first time I want to point out. In Luke 19, it says, the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And so that presents for us Jesus's mission. But the other time, a little bit earlier on in Luke 7, it talks about Jesus's method, and I don't want to over-exaggerate the point, but it says, the Son of Man came, second use of that phrase, but this time, the Son of Man came eating and drinking. And so, and I actually do believe it's worth thinking about Jesus' mission and Jesus' method revealed there.
What about the important element of who Jesus was eating and drinking with? Because right now I'm thinking, that church person who almost has lost a connection with their friends outside of church life. And not everybody is considered a nice person. How do you reflect on Jesus' choice of eating companions?
Well, this is it. Jesus is the great upside down, the table turner, not usually at meal times, but he really is. He's reversing our values. So, Neil, if I can just quickly zip through some of these instances in the Gospel of Luke, you get a picture of it. In Luke 5, he's eating with tax collectors and sinners at Levi's home. And then in Luke 7, he's anointed at the home of Simon the Pharisee during a meal. In Luke 9, he's feeding the 5,000, all manner of people there. In Luke 10, he's with Mary and Martha at their place having a meal. In Luke 11, he's condemning the Pharisees and the teachers of the law at another meal. In Luke 14, he's at a meal where he urges people to invite the poor to their meals rather than their friends. Again, that upside downness. In Luke 19, he's inviting himself to dinner at Zacchaeus' place. In Luke 22, the Last Supper. And then in Luke 24, the risen Christ has a meal with two disciples in Emmaus. And then later on, eating fish with his disciples in Jerusalem. Now, two things to say about that. Lots and lots of references in Luke about eating, but also, as you rightly point out, quite a strategic use, even in Luke, in what he chooses to pick up on, in highlighting that Jesus uses meals to really upturn the value systems of the world, and indeed of the Jewish religious system, to say, hey, this is different. My kingdom doesn't follow the same rules.
What I can hear you saying here is that if you're looking at Jesus' example, it's not always just a fun dinner party with friends. There's an intentionality about it, and sometimes there's those challenges. Sometimes there's that conflict, and sometimes it's a serious moment that Jesus leads his dinner guests to.
Oh, look, absolutely. And in fact, one theologian, a guy called Robert Karras, he says a couple of things which I thought were worth grabbing. The first point he makes is in Luke's gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal, which is to say there's such an emphasis there. But then he makes this point. In Luke's gospel, Jesus got himself crucified by the way he ate. Again, we can overplay that, I suppose, but I think he's making a good point. He's saying that what so riled up the people that eventually would crucify him was so much of what he had to say and who he ate with and how he used those meals as such a prophetic way of communicating gospel truth.
Turns out I'm coming from breakfast and heading towards lunch and then probably having something for dinner tonight. And you're probably in the same boat too. Hey, when we talk about, eating in, eating out, Jesus was eating lots of different places. Sometimes he was the guest. So what do we talk about when we come to our own homes as a place of hospitality? That seems to be the most likely that I'd be thinking of. But in-home meal preparation, is this something that is important?
Look, I really do think it is. There is something culturally in the world that we live in now where it's becoming, and it depends on the culture you're from, of course, but in most cultures, if you don't want to be too close to someone or leave someone at a certain strategic distance, you meet on neutral turf. But if you really want to engender trust in the relationship and respect and appreciation, to open your front door, invite someone in onto your turf in the privacy of your own home, to sit them down at a meal, speaks, I really believe, very, very powerfully. But it's not just that. I really believe the Lord, uses it. And if I can quote John Mark Comer, who I'm sure, Neil, many of your listeners will have heard or will have read, originally from Bridgetown Church in the US, but he writes this in terms of that very point. There's no better place to get to know someone than over a meal No better place to dialogue and even disagree in love. He says this about himself, I'm no skilled evangelist. It's a weakness in my discipleship, not a strength. But I can tell you this, after living in one of the most secular cities in the world, all of the best conversations I've ever had with people far from God have been around my table. All of them, which I think is a fabulous quote. Now, he says, my table, I want to suggest, if it's appropriate or if it's not appropriate to bring someone into your home, just get around a meal table, even if it is in a cafe or a restaurant. No problem there. But that opportunity to bring people into our home, I think, is very powerful.
Like you, when we've had friends around and turned it into a bit of a dinner party or whatever, and sometimes the way the conversation just unlocks is beautiful. And I'm wondering about your thoughts here, because you could be intentional and endeavour to force the conversation to issues around faith, or you could let those things just come forward in an organic sort of a way. What's your preference here?
Oh, look, completely the organic way. It's not at all to suggest that we are not deliberate in our efforts to communicate gospel truth, to find ways to tell the story of Jesus, both in history and in personal application. But what you get over 1 or 2 or 3 hours of mealtime is you get all the time in the world to ask good questions. And I honestly think, and this is not strictly speaking about mealtimes, but it's a wonderful technique, and that is that when we're talking to people that we're getting to know, the power of good questions to really engender trust. And look, this is not a technique. This is the authenticity of who we really are in our hearts as people who love others. We want to know about them. But really good questions to open up people's lives and hearts to us. And then what always happens is questions come the other way. And it's not long before you're speaking authentically and truthfully about who you are. And in that context, really telling the truth about what Jesus has done in our lives, even for those of us who are the most fearful, it is the most natural thing to do.
We've all got a story somewhere of our own faith, and that's what we often talk about as sharing our testimony. There's a testimony of coming to faith. There's all those testimonies too of growing in our faith and reaching some levels of maturity, and then having this passion to be able to share with others. Hey, you've got some resources, Power to Change resources. What is it that you've got that could be helpful for listeners who are thinking about being a bit more intentional about having a dinner party?
Yeah, so we don't have resources, strictly speaking, on dinner parties, and I think that's because that is such a straightforward and easy thing to do that perhaps it defies even needing a resource. But I just wanted to share one thing with you. As Power to Change, we have a program called My Friends, and you can find that on our website at powertochange.org.au. But we've just pulling one little interesting piece out of that, just as a taster. We use a thing called a daisy, and it really is as simple as this. You get an A4 sheet of paper, you draw a little circle in the middle, which arguably is the middle of the daisy flower, if you were to look at it, and you put your name in it. And then you draw a series of petals, nice big ones that cover the page. Maybe you can fit 8 of them emanating from the center of that daisy. And then what we do is we spend some time to look at the different spheres of influence that we operate in. Some Christians listening may remember phrases like oikos, map, or something like that. It's essentially that same idea, but it's to say, all right, God has placed me in various networks of influence. Who do I know? Now, obvious things like family, friends, workmates, if you've got kids at school, the parents that you see there, sports clubs, things of that nature. And very quickly, but also in just a moment of prayerfulness, to start writing down the names of people that have not encountered the Lord, that you know through those various spheres. And it's a very powerful thing to begin to strategically, intentionally pray for those people, looking for opportunities. But again, when we think about looking for opportunities, what does that mean? Well, can I ground it in something as concrete as you have a lot of relationships already where you can invite those people around for a meal on no other pretext than you want to get to know them better. And that is very powerful.
As you said a little earlier in our conversation, Jesus comes eating and drinking, and I've had the thought too, just as you're just sharing those insights there, that while you can get together for a meal, even simpler to get together with coffee for friends. Does the same principles work here?
Yes, they do. They do. And look, if I could quote one more guy, Neil, on this, which I think is helpful, because again, back to this point, we're not all evangelists. A guy called Jim Chester says this: we can make community and mission sound like specialized activities that belong to the experts. Some people have a vested interest in doing this because it makes them feel extraordinary. Some push mission beyond the scope of ordinary Christians. But the Son of Man, and we've talked about eat like Jesus, but the Son of Man came eating and drinking. It's not complicated. True, it's not always easy. It involves people invading your space or going to places where you don't feel very comfortable, but it's not complicated. If you share a meal, and this is Tim's challenge, not mine, if you share a meal 3 or 4 times a week and you have a passion for Jesus, then you will be building up the Christian community and reaching out in mission. And that's our challenge today, Neil. It's to say, okay, maybe not 3 to 4 times a week, but if we can open up our homes and do something as simple as get to know people over a meal, asking good questions, be ready to talk about the Lord, I really believe the Holy Spirit's going to bless and anoint that. And I've seen that over and over again.
Wow. Eating and drinking with some intentionality. And, as we talk about these things, and we said just early in the conversation, sounds too simple, but really what you've done today is unlock some things, I think, for some people who are saying it all is too hard when it comes to this idea of evangelism, discipleship, but you've just given us permission to enjoy the journey of sharing our faith. And sometimes we need that permission, and we need to understand that it actually is a really pleasant thing to get together with people and to talk about the things of God. So this permission idea, this is actually pretty powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And so, look, if it helps anybody, I give them permission. Go ahead and do it. But can I say this too? It's been such a blessing to me. These meals that my wife and I have been having, granted in our cases, it's often been with people who do know the Lord. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But there's always something in it for us. There's such a richness in finding out what other people's life experiences are about, and sometimes how God has equipped us with real strong words of encouragement for those people, but then also the other way around. It never ceases to amaze me how I think I'm out there on mission and God's blessing me. So if that helps some people as well, then go for it, because there's something in it for us. It's not all about what we're giving. God also gives back.
Wonderful stuff. Alister Cameron is serving with Power to Change, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ, and considered to be the biggest mission organisation in the world. And what great wisdom to be able to share today around eating and drinking, just like Jesus. You can connect with Alister at powertochange.org.au. powertochange.org.au, and no doubt you mentioned there was a program or two, one called My Friends, and you mentioned the Daisy. No doubt listeners can get some insight there when they go to the website powertochange.org.au. Alister, thanks so much for joining us once again today on 2020.
Thanks, Neil. It's been great.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.